Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ofsted's annual report launch for 2020. My name's Chris Jones. I'm Director of Corporate Strategy at Ofsted, and I'll be hosting today, and we're very much excited to be coming to you virtually for the first time. The running order today, we're going to hear first from Ofsted's Chair, Dame Christine Ryan, then from Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman, and finally we'll do a question and answer session with the Ofsted senior team. You can submit your questions at any time, but the sooner the better, please, so we can kind of sort and organise them behind the scenes. If anyone asks what counts as a substantial meal, I will have you put on a list somewhere, so please keep questions relevant. You can also tweet about the event using the hashtag OfstedAR20. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ofsted's Chair, Dame Christine Ryan.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of this year's annual report. We really appreciate your efforts to join us, albeit remotely. This is my first time introducing the annual report. I took on the role of chair in August of this year, following my previous work in education, inspection and regulation, both here and internationally. Joining in the midst of a pandemic hasn't been ideal, and it has prevented me from seeing firsthand the work that our inspectors and regulatory professionals do. Nevertheless, I have also been able to shadow countless meetings and meet regularly online with staff and board colleagues, many of which are with us today. This has also not been an easy year for those we inspect and regulate, and it is clear that challenges will remain with us all into the new year. But many have responded in exceptional ways to the demands, including amongst our own teams within Ofsted. When lockdown was imposed in March and our routine inspection activities ceased, HMCI and her team swiftly redeployed many staff to local authorities and other government departments that were under pressure. In this changed landscape of uncertainty and new opportunities, however, our purpose remains unchanged. That is to make sure that organisations providing education, training and care do so to a high standard. This annual report shows the central role that Ofsted continues to play, even in this unusual time, in regulating provision for the most vulnerable in our society, though our other work has obviously had a reduced focus. But as we move into something more akin to normal work in the coming months, we look forward to resuming our full range of operations. The board will have its own role to play in grappling with the strategic issues that the pandemic has brought to the fore. There will be a great deal for us to do in the year ahead. But for now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Her Majesty's Chief Inspector, Amanda Spielman, who will talk a little more about our annual report.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming to this virtual launch of my annual report. As you're having to watch on a screen, I'm going to be briefer than usual. Many of you will be listening out for your area of interest, but today I'm going to talk more generally, but with a particular slant towards schools. There is, of course, a great deal to read in the report about all of the areas in which we work, and I've also asked colleagues to record short videos with their reflections on the year. So after this launch, you can follow up on early years, social care, independent schools, unregulated schools, further education and skills, and on special educational needs, all on the Ofsted YouTube channel. Every year, this speech is a bit of a balancing act between what's covered in the report, which is of course about the previous academic year, and more recent developments. And of course this year, the contrast between the first 6 months of that year and the period since could hardly be starker. Talking about 2019, right now, that feels like reminiscing about halcyon days. The pandemic isn't just a colossal disruption, It's also bringing out truths about our society. It's been so hard for so many people in so many ways. Losing people we love, losing livelihoods, losing freedoms, losing the things that motivate us, losing everyday pleasures and joy. But it's also given us new insights into how we work together and into how our institutions interact with us and with each other. Truths that we might previously have suspected are now confirmed and laid bare. As I've reflected on 2020, it's the breadth of the role of schools that stands out. Closing schools to most pupils had an enormous impact. The decision caused a great splash. The boat is still rocking, and we don't yet know quite how far the ripples will go. The crisis has really shown us how important schools are to the fabric of society, given how much they now do beyond their core educational purpose. Education's been compulsory for less than 150 years. For most of its history, it's been a relatively simple business for most children: reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious instruction. Until relatively recently, most schools had no conception of any wider role. Historically speaking, it's quite a new thing for schools to be more than places of education. But the COVID crisis really has shown how much is now expected of schools. I was reminded of this a few weeks ago when I was being interviewed about our autumn visits. We've been visiting nurseries, schools, colleges, children's homes and local authorities, and this has informed a series of reports with more to come. The most recent set attracted a lot of attention, and for good reason, because school and nursery leaders had reported that some children had actually regressed through lockdown. Time didn't just stand still for them, it went backwards. I can give some examples from our reports. Potty-trained children returning in the autumn back in nappies, and children who'd learnt to hold and use a pencil properly, having lost that skill. Education standards for older children had also suffered. For example, a loss of stamina when it came to reading and writing. Some commentators were outraged and fumed at schools and nurseries having to make up for gaps in parenting. And I have in the past pointed out that too many children reach primary school age without being potty trained, but that wasn't the issue here. And blame is not the point either. It's about the impact of an event that's disrupted families, nurseries, schools. What closures have reminded us about here is the importance of consolidation in learning. The knowledge and skills that matter aren't learned instantly. They have to be practiced and reinforced, ideally both at home and in school. Some children have thrived in lockdown. The one whose parents could be at home, work flexibly, weren't too distracted by younger siblings, and could help with remote learning. But many households just don't have that kind of capacity and flexibility. These children also missed out on the time they'd usually have with teachers and staff at school or nursery. They haven't had the chance to consolidate recent learning. And by the way, this picture is not unique to England. We've been hearing from our counterparts across Europe that it's looking similar elsewhere. I do want to say, however, that while it's very clear that there is learning loss in the short term, it is simply too early to say what the long-term impact will be. There have been some alarming extrapolations, but the most important thing is to get on with the job of teaching children, whether it's the things they learn at home or at school. Good parenting and good teaching will fill most of the gaps for most children. But we also saw the dramatic impact of school closures in falling referrals to children's social care. Teachers are often the eyes that spot signs of abuse and the ears that hear stories of neglect. Closing schools didn't just leave the children who, unbeknown to others, suffer at home without respite. It also took them out of sight of those who could help. I want to talk about these out-of-sight children a bit more, as they concern us all. When nurseries and schools closed in March, they were told to remain open to the most vulnerable, which of course meant those whose need was already identified. And even of these, we know that relatively few actually attended. The rest stayed at home, some inevitably in harm's way. There was a concerted effort to reach these children, with partnership working across England. Many of our staff moved temporarily into local authorities to help. It's worth noting that the COVID challenge has given new impetus to partnership working across education and social care. But even with the best efforts of so many, attendance remains stubbornly low. And even now, while referrals have been rising, they're still below previous levels. We don't know why, perhaps in part because of the current constraints on how schools operate. Our autumn briefings have also covered head teachers' reports of children who haven't returned at all. Some parents have removed children to educate them at home. And it appears they've done so mostly because of concerns around COVID, rather than a newfound enthusiasm for homeschooling. A recent survey by the Association of Directors of Children's Services shows an increase of nearly 40% since this time last year, taking the number of children believed to be homeschooled above 75,000. And a significant proportion of the children who have come off school rolls are already known to one or more external children's services because they have special needs, previous attendance issues, or other interventions in their lives. And almost all children, vulnerable or otherwise, are missing out on a lot when they aren't at school. And yes, I do know there are exceptions here, but they are exceptions. Some homeschooled children will have a great experience, but other families will find it harder than they thought, and their children could lose out as a result. We must be alive to these risks, and we must also watch out for bad practices creeping back in that could compound risk. We don't want to see any schools off-rolling children, and we need all schools to make the effort to help children with SEND to attend. We know that many SEND children and their parents particularly struggled during lockdown, as so many services were withdrawn. Of course, safeguarding's been a core responsibility of schools for many years. That's not getting any easier. And schools are now expected to address wider health concerns. Our reports show that children's physical fitness has suffered from lockdown. School leaders told us that children came back less active and less fit. This highlights the importance of physical education and school sport. If we look back, school sport was once about finding a new talent, developing teamwork, and even building moral fibre, as much as about physical fitness. Now, it's also one of the ways schools contribute to countering childhood obesity, alongside the school canteen, which we expect to serve up healthy, nutritious, and affordable meals. And there are social concerns besides obesity that have become interwoven with schooling. Understandable concerns about youth crime and violence, for example, have driven some to decry the use of exclusion as part of a school's approach to maintaining behaviour, and expect mainstream schools to find all the answers. We all expect teachers to maintain a calm and orderly learning environment. It's critical for children, it's valued by parents, and yes, it's scrutinised by Ofsted. So schools devise strategies to teach and manage behaviour. Exclusion is the ultimate sanction, to be used only in extremis. But calls to ban it entirely, on the argument that excluded children can be drawn into crime, presents challenges. Trying to address such a complex social issue by constraining schools to this extent risks losing sight of the needs of classmates, teachers, and even of excluded children themselves at a point that no one has yet worked out what will meet their needs. Education, of course, has intrinsic value, and now we expect it to keep accelerating social mobility. And increasingly, we see efforts to commandeer schools and the curriculum in support of worthy social issues and campaigns. In the last year, many of these calls have been about environmental causes and against racism. Climate change activists have called for new qualifications or more explicit alterations to the curriculum. They sometimes forget the importance of grounding climate change within the wider body of learning about science and about geography. And they don't always notice how much schools already do in this space. Last month, The Times published research findings that Black and minority ethnic Britons see changes in education as the most effective way to address their concerns. When asked what policy changes would make the most difference to ethnic minority lives in Britain, the top answer was a more diverse school curriculum. Why is that? Is it because there's a fundamental issue with the national curriculum that limits exposure to diversity in literature, history, or geography? Or is it because there's a widely held and justifiable assumption that changing things in school is the key to changing wider social attitudes. And of course, social change is difficult. We've seen friction in some schools where, for example, lessons making children aware that loving relationships exist between same-sex couples conflict with some parents' religious beliefs. They argue that the curriculum has moved too far in the name of equality and that it now infringes on their religious freedoms. I'm not making a moral point here, but rather a practical one. Schools are the go-to solution, perhaps more than any other institution in society. The arguments are often impassioned and well-constructed. Most significantly, perhaps, they're often amplified by thousands of voices using social media, online petitions, and by well-meaning commentators. Treating schools as the great panacea of our time underlines the importance of education, but it doesn't make it any easier to run a school. The pressure on schools to do more than teach their current curriculum continues to grow. And of course, COVID has added another layer of complexity. Schools must now be experts in limiting the spread of an invisible infection, organising themselves around complicated and shifting sets of health rules. And when it's impossible to have children at home, they're also expected to switch seamlessly to remote education and to maintain the pace and precision of their curriculum delivery to pupils who are away from the teacher's gaze and susceptible to all the temptations of home. This is a very big ask. And by the way, none of us should be seduced by the idea that remote education can match the classroom for most children. It's a lot better than nothing, but for most, it can't match it. And this isn't just about social or technological inequalities. In many instances, it's about motivation, the same issue that dogs so many adults adjusting to working from home. Nevertheless, just as schools have adapted to so much else, now they must adapt to this new reality too. In many ways, schools are actually the victim of their own success. They're far removed from Victorian incarnations. They play critical roles in children's educational, physical, and social development. They're a crucial part of the care system that protects the vulnerable. And they support children with a whole range of needs. They do far more than they're often given credit for. It's a good moment to thank all of you who work in education and in social care as you continue to do your level best at a time of great pressure and uncertainty. I've outlined where I think schools are, and I return to the question I asked at the start. Are we getting the balance right? Do we want schools to have such extensive roles beyond education, as the community hub, as the triage point for support services and intervention, as the go-to solution for social problems, as the guardian of children's waistlines? And if we do, are we giving schools the tools and capacity to do these jobs well and leaving them enough time and headspace for the core job of education? The COVID crisis has stress-tested so many parts of our society, and education and social care are feeling that stress. As we look forward, in hope of a better year ahead, I hope there will be time to consider these questions. I know that some of my audience will see the impact of COVID as a reason why Ofsted shouldn't return to school inspections for a while yet. And I know that school leaders have been looking for certainty. I'm expecting the government to make an announcement about this very soon, as it is ultimately their decision. But I'm not expecting us to be doing graded inspections from January. We need to take account of the national situation. And indeed, we've always said that the timing of our return was under review and also the form of our inspections. We do understand what teachers are going through. Though with such positive news about vaccines, we are all hoping for a return to some sense of normality not too far into 2021. But I must remind you, we also know what children are going through. We owe it to them to have good provision for them wherever they are, and where it isn't, this needs to be known about. The normal scrutiny within the system has been absent for a good while now, and it does need to be reintroduced next year. And that includes schools formerly covered by the outstanding exemption, now removed. And of course, it also includes the other sectors we look at, all of which play such crucial roles in children's lives. Childminders, nurseries, colleges, children's homes, fostering and adoption agencies. The list goes on. And older learners too, whether post-16 students or apprentices, adults looking to retrain, or prisoners wanting to transform their future through education. Our role for all of these is to raise standards and improve lives. And that's why it's important that we are able to return to our work next year. But when we do return, we will not be looking at the challenges of the first lockdown, and we will not be expecting people to have performed miracles, but rather to have done their best in the circumstances. Because we all want to do what's in children's best interests. Our autumn visits led us to a clear conclusion. Keeping schools open is unbelievably important. I wholeheartedly support the government's stance on this through this second lockdown. We must not deprive children of all that schools do and all that schools are. And if we're serious in that aim, we must carry on aiming for the same standards as before this virus arrived, though in the short term, we all know the trade-offs must inevitably be made. In this collective endeavour, we will play our part. We always remember that education should be about broadening minds and enriching communities and advancing civilization, in short, about leaving the world a better place than we found it. We'll carry on working to help preserve and promote the standards of education and care that this generation needs and has every right to expect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And thank you, Christine, for your introduction as well. We'll move on to the question and answer portion of this morning. We have had a few questions in already. Please do keep them coming through. We'll aim to get through as many of them as possible. I'll just introduce the rest of the Ofsted senior team whilst people are feeding through their questions. We have Yvette Stanley, who's our National Director for Social Care. Morning, Yvette. We have Karen Shepperson, who's our Director for People and Operations. Morning, Karen.
Good morning.
And we have Chris Russell, who is our Acting Director for Education. Morning, Chris.
Morning.
Our first question then is for Yvette. This comes from Sharon Fenton from Rosie Apple Childcare. Sharon says, SEND in children is a concern at present and support from the local authority can be difficult. Will the impact of the pandemic be taken into account? We are completing what we need to, however, the timings can be longer than usual. Our local authority knows this and knows that it's impacting on settings. Will Ofsted gather information around this in local areas prior to inspections restarting?
Thank you, Sharon, for your question. And we're about to publish in our next set of commentaries the wealth of information we have on SEN from our bird's eye view in terms of visiting local authorities, childcare settings, social care settings. And you're absolutely right. That gives us the perspective where we can see the impact of the disruption to health services and to wider support services for this really important group of children. So we are really, really aware of the context. And we're also aware that partners, including settings, are working really, really hard to gather those services around children. So absolutely aware of context. We will be looking to see how you're working together and how colleagues are wrapping those services around. And absolutely, that context will be taken on board.
Thank you, Yvette. I've got a question for Chris Russell on the education side from John Jolly from Parent Kind. Chris, what has Ofsted been doing to gauge parents' views on how schools are performing in relation to the delivery of remote learning?
With our visits this term, we've kept a pretty light footprint actually in schools, because we thought that was right given the particular challenges that schools face this term, getting back to full opening, etc. So our discussions at the moment are essentially with the head teacher and with the senior team in the school, and we don't have engagement further, and we're not routinely then talking to parents in those visits. So we are getting some information, I mean, some very rich information, and many people will have seen the briefings that we put out recently where we talk quite a bit about remote learning. So we are finding out quite a lot about what schools are doing in this area, but what we're not doing at the moment is getting that breadth of information and that breadth of evidence, including by talking to parents. And that's very much what we see as we gradually move back to inspection work, where we will be able to actually get more evidence and more information about parents' views and experiences.
If I come in there, perhaps it's worth saying we're doing quite a bit of work on remote learning through the autumn, partly through a survey of parents and teachers, which is being carried out for us by an external agency, and also through visits to a number of schools to discuss their remote learning models in depth. But we are surveying parents directly.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, I've got you, Amanda. I've got a question for you from Kenny Wheeler from the Driver Youth Trust. If schools are the go-to solution, will there be any recommendations from Ofsted to the DfE on increasing school funding? Will they be given sufficient funding to deliver education as well as reduce the impact of COVID on their school communities?
I think, as most of those watching this know, we don't have the responsibility for looking at how schools spend their money or looking at the adequacy of their funding. We did publish a report on school perceptions of their funding situation a few months ago, but unless our responsibilities change, we won't be able to make recommendations about levels of school funding.
Thank you, Amanda. And I've got a couple of questions that I'll around the return to inspection in January, one from Freddie Whitaker, one from Will Hazel. I'll just combine them because I know you won't want to answer hundreds of questions about the same topic. If graded inspections are not going to resume in January, can you give us a time frame of when they will resume? Amanda, you rightly says Freddie, that leaders need certainty. That applies not just to January, but for the rest of the academic year. And Will's take on that was, I appreciate it is the government's decision, but is it Ofsted's preference to restart inspections in January?
I wish I could be more specific, Will and Freddie. It would be great if we could lay out plans today, but it is the Secretary of State's announcement. I hope it's coming very soon. Our concern is to get the balance right, to do what is important for children, but equally to recognise the situation that schools, colleges, nurseries are all in, and to find a way of working next year that fairly recognises all of those pressures.
Thank you, Amanda. Yvette, I'll come to you next. We've got a question. Jonathan Stanley from the National Centre for Excellence in Residential Children's Homes. Does Ofsted share their concern that though there have been new registrations in the last 6 months, the range and availability of the supply has not resulted in us having the homes we need in the right place, and so we cannot make the right placement at the right time for the right child? Does Ofsted see a need to plan a workforce strategy for all placements?
Absolutely, Jonathan. The short answer is yes. We absolutely focused our efforts during lockdown on making sure that we were registering children's homes, particularly with people with a track record for good and outstanding provision. But we still see a growth in areas where there is quite a supply and not enough children's homes across the country. Absolutely looking for the care review to look at the whole chain of supply, from preventative services, keeping children safely with their families, through kinship and foster care support and residential care. During lockdown, we had worrying waiting lists for secure provision. We're quite worried about sufficient provision for children needing that welfare secure and therapeutic support. So absolutely. And as our report says, we still have issues in terms of registered managers, and we would really like, so we'd like an overall commissioning strategy supported by a workforce strategy. No local authority or one set of commissioners on their own can solve this issue. It needs national, regional and local authorities working together with a commissioning strategy and a supporting resourcing and workforce strategy. Absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Yvette. Amanda, I'll come back to you. Question from Eleanor Busby from the Press Association. You mentioned calls about diversifying the curriculum. Do you think the government or schools could do more to make children feel represented in the curriculum?
I think if people go and look at the curriculum, they will find that it's pretty broad and designed to give schools a considerable amount of flexibility, precisely to adapt to circumstances. The level of prescription is pretty light. The other thing that I think is important is that we all remember that the curriculum is there to serve many purposes, one of which is to make children feel represented, but there are so many others. So for any review of curriculum, it's important to stand back and say, what are all the things that the people reviewing it are trying to achieve, and have we got a good balance that reflects all of those purposes? I think my message would be, don't revise the curriculum in the context of a single issue or purpose. Make sure that periodic reviews take all purposes into account.
Thank you. A question from Camilla Turner from the Daily Telegraph. You mentioned about campaigns to teach more about climate change in school and that this should be grounded in science. What is the danger of teaching about climate change when it's not grounded in science?
I think if it's not grounded in science, there's no real understanding underneath it. It becomes a sort of a morality tale or something quasi-religious. It's really important that people have a grounded understanding, so that they can think about that in the context of career choices, in the context of their own personal behaviour. That helps people take sort of rational decisions, not just emotional positions. So I think there's real value in good linkage through to the rest of the curriculum.
Thank you. One more question for you, Amanda, and I'll give you a break. From Nicola Walcott from The Times. Your report says that some primary schools are not being rated good because they focus too much on reading, writing and maths. Will there be any softening of this in light of schools trying to get back up to standard in the basics post-lockdown? Could you expand on what the balance should be?
Of course, when we go back to inspecting, we will be looking at schools in the context in which they are operating and have had to work over the last few months. As I said in my speech, we absolutely recognise that there are hard choices to be made. Learning time has been lost, no two ways about it. And what we expect people to do is to make rational and sensible choices. And of course, the initial work that we do. So, for example, when we're able to sort of pilot the next iteration of inspection, which will have to take remote curriculum and learning into account as part of the curriculum delivery, of course, that will give us an opportunity to test out how we get this right and reflect school performance fairly.
Thank you. Chris Russell, I'll come to you for a couple of questions. The first one is Jill Whittaker from HIT Training Limited. Jill says, work-based learning, including apprenticeships, has continued throughout the year, albeit in reduced numbers as employers struggle to be able to afford to recruit new apprentices. My organisation took part in an inspection pilot this year, which went extremely well, and our pivot to remote was praised. We're now reaching a stage where some apprentices have spent more time out of the workplace than in it. Whilst providers continue to engage remotely or in situ where possible, how will this be viewed by Ofsted inspections? Will simulated work environments be acceptable temporarily whilst there is no other option?
Yeah, I mean, I think as thank you for that question. And I think as Amanda said earlier, really, given the situation that we're in, people are having to find creative solutions to the challenges that they face. And we're seeing quite a lot of evidence of that. I mean, we'd always want to see it really through the lens of the learner. What's the experience for the learner? And what's being done to ensure that the learner gets the best experience possible. But clearly within all of that too, while we see the benefits of remote learning, particularly with dealing with situations like this, then, we also really recognise that real advantage of face-to-face. But always we look at it through, what's being done in the interests of the learner.
Thanks, Chris. So a question again for you from Sam Henson from the National Governance Association. You will know that many governors and trustees have a huge role in the education sector and in providing both support and challenge to leaders as they respond to the pandemic. How will Ofsted liaise with governing boards going into 2021, giving visibility to this crucial role? And what advice can you give to governing boards, particularly in terms of the well-being of senior leaders who are currently under so much pressure?
I mean, I think what we've seen actually through this term and through our interim visits is typically the fantastic job that governors are actually doing in that area, and then actually really thinking about the needs of senior leaders who are facing real challenges. So I mean, I think it all comes down really to what we'd always say about good governance. It's understanding the school, understanding the needs, providing that support and challenge, and really keeping that big picture and helping leaders to keep that big picture, especially as they have been, facing unprecedented situations and having to respond and make creative solutions. So very much, I think, as we gradually return to inspection work, we'll see more of that. Clearly, we'll have more engagement than we've been having on interim visits with governors, to talk about the role that they've played, and the role that governance has played.
Thank you, Chris. I'll continue with you. A question from David Hatchett from the Academy's Enterprise Trust. Now that the outstanding exemption has been removed, will the re-inspection of these settings be prioritised in any particular order or way?
I think, clearly we await the announcement about what will happen as we go forward. But I think looking at all of that, once we have a clear picture from government about what will happen from January and onwards, we will be looking very carefully at then how we turn those plans into reality, how we select providers appropriately, etc., and that we roll out our inspection work. So I think that will be all considered as part of that bigger picture as we look at how we inspect over the coming months once inspection does start.
Thank you, Chris. One question for Yvette, and then I'll come back to Amanda. Question, Yvette, from Purnima Tanuku. Apologies, Purnima, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. From the National Day Nurseries Association. With the impact of COVID likely to continue well into the future, will Ofsted review the way inspections are carried out, and will Ofsted consult with the early years sector?
Absolutely, Purnima. As we are at the minute in terms of our move from window to cycle in terms of early years, as colleagues out there in early years will know, we're the regulator and inspector of childcare settings. So we're interested in getting the right balance through the registration process, through responding to concerns, and for routine inspection. We hope the colleagues will look at our consultation and respond. And we're absolutely focused on getting proportionality and enabling providers to understand the full suite of regulatory tools and how we might be engaging with them going forward.
Thank you, Yvette. Amanda, I'll come back to you. This question's from Amy Gibbons from the TES. Why are Ofsted inspectors planning to physically go into schools to conduct visits when we are still in heightened COVID restrictions?
We're working, as we have done throughout, absolutely sort of in line with PHE guidance. We didn't go into schools during the month lockdown that's finishing today. Before that, we were doing visits in person. We think there's a lot of value in the sort of human conversation and connection, and we believe that's still the case. So with the reduction in restrictions, we will be going back in. For the remainder of our autumn visits, we will be operating the same deferral policy also, which has given some flexibility, for example, in areas that have recently gone into tier 3. But it is important, I think, that we have eyes on the ground where we can, that we don't simply default to looking at people on screens from our homes.
Thank you, Amanda. A question from Tom Middlehurst from the Association of School and College Leaders. Given the rise of elective home education this year, would Ofsted ever consider asking government to have greater regulatory power over homeschooling?
I've consistently said that I don't think we have enough information about homeschooling. There are a great many things in that category. There are some children whose parents are very much willing and happy home educating parents with children who are thriving. We should never lose sight of the fact that it works extremely well for some. But it also includes children who are there only because parents haven't been able to find a school that can cope with special needs, because they've been off-rolled, because children are really in illegal schools. As we've now heard, parents whose children are out of school because they're concerned about COVID. There's a great deal in there. I've argued strongly that at the very least we should have a basic register of children who are being educated at home, so that we know who they are, where they are, and who is taking responsibility for their education. That would be a first step. I was very pleased that the government took up this recommendation, but like so many things, I think there've been some delays given the lack of space in the legislative timetable while Brexit and COVID work their way through the system. But I very much hope this is something that will get attention next year.
Thank you. Rachel Friedman from Pages says, how worried is Amanda about the financial and mental health pressures caused by this increased responsibility on senior leaders? Yeah. Is this sustainable in the coming year?
Yeah, I think there's been a terrific amount of pressure on senior leaders in schools, in every kind of education, actually in pretty much every kind of organisation around the country, and I suspect in every country. It's been a colossal task. It's like everybody having to start a new job, coping with lots of things they know nothing about and have never had to deal with before, or very little about, and without more experienced people around who've been through it, able to show you the ropes and tell you what to do. So it's genuinely tough. I think the vaccine lifeline that we're all looking at is something that I'm really, really hoping can start to alleviate the pressure relatively soon. And even when that works its way through, I'm not under any illusions about what a challenge it's going to be over the next few years as the educational and social consequences for children work their way through. This is not a get everybody vaccinated and boom, everything is back to normal. This is a multi-year recovery.
I have a question from Emily Frith, who is from the Office of the Children's Commissioner. It says, COVID is likely to have worsened the disadvantage gap between children on free school meals, vulnerable children and their peers. What action do you think needs to be taken by government, local authorities and schools to address this and level up educational opportunity in the next 5 years?
COVID's worsened all kinds of gaps. I mean, a lot of it is around disadvantage, but there are two other sort of big strands that I think we mustn't lose sight of. One is around just children with low prior attainment, whether they have a disadvantage label or not. What we hear consistently says that the lowest attaining children really struggled with remote learning, find it very hard, still do, of course, because many children are having to learn remotely at the moment. So they are more likely to be falling behind. And children who struggle with motivation. We hear many, many reports, perhaps more of older children, teenagers, for example, who you can't expect to work quite so closely under their parents' eye, perhaps as younger children. Also losing motivation, struggling to put in much time. We know how little time most children spend on schoolwork when they're at home. So I think it's important not to frame this narrowly as a problem about disadvantage. And of course, getting children back in school, back into the structure and framework and motivational strength of normal lessons is a big part of it. And for most children will be enough to get them back on track. But also the recognizing where there are genuine sort of catch-up needs to be addressed through tutoring or other kinds of in-school provision, and getting those referrals fast to all the services for special educational needs, making sure that children get the speech and language therapy, the other services they should have been having over the last few months, to get them as close as possible to back on track as fast as possible.
Thank you, Amanda. Yvette, I'll come back to you for a couple of questions. The first one is from Andrew Isaac from the Children's Services Development Group, who says, from their transitions report of 2020, 53% of care leavers aged 19 to 21 are classified as NEET, or their destination is unknown to local authorities. How does Ofsted plan to help improve the management of this cohort and the provisions made to improve these outcomes?
I think, Andrew, this is another important question for the care review, which the DfE are going to announce imminently, I understand. Outcomes, education, employment and wider outcomes, including health outcomes for our care leavers, just aren't good enough. In Ofsted, we have the opportunity again to look at that cohort, whether it's in our FE or apprenticeship inspections or through our inspection of local authorities in children's services. Absolutely, it's an issue that has been worsened by the pandemic. We've seen care leavers lose their employment. We've seen some really good partnership work between FE, local authority, and other wider services to support individual children. But I do think it's one of those groups that we'll need to have a focused view on in terms of that care review.
Thank you, Yvette. And Mari Davis from the National Association for Independent and Non-Maintained Special Schools says, SEND children and young people are likely to be disproportionately impacted by COVID. Will there be an understanding that re-engaging SEND students will sometimes be challenging?
Absolutely. I mean, the term SEN and disabilities is a huge cohort. We've seen some really challenging situations for families where the children are at home and they've lost respite and valuable support services. We've seen some really good work from schools and local authorities trying to get some of those children back in schools. And we've seen residential special schools where those children have been in school all the time, getting a great deal of good support, but really worried about their lack of contact with the family, who like in the adult care sector, haven't always been able to visit because of COVID restrictions. Absolutely, there's a group of children that we all, the whole children's services, education, social care, and our wider partners need to make sure that we're all working together to do each to contribute our bit to support those children back into school, back into therapy, back into respite, and back into all those wider support services.
Thank you, Yvette. Chris, I'll come back to you for a couple more questions on restarting inspections. Freddie from Schools Week says, can you tell us any more about what inspection will look like from January? You said you don't expect to return to graded inspections, but does this mean the current programme of visits will continue, or will inspections resume but without grades?
Yeah, I mean, clearly we do need to await the announcement about exactly what we'll be doing. And Amanda has said, you know, we don't expect to be returning to graded inspections when we start. But we have a range of other inspection tools that we could use to meet the circumstances. So, you know, there are many things that we could do short of full graded inspections. And clearly all of those we will be ensuring that we can operate safely within the context of COVID.
Thank you, Chris. And Amy Gibbons from the TES, will Ofsted use its existing framework when it does return to full inspections, or will it need to come up with something new or different to recognise the challenges schools face through COVID?
We do strongly feel that when we do return to full graded inspections, that the right way to do it is through our EIF, through our Education Inspection Framework. We spent a considerable amount of time getting that framework right. We worked really closely with the sector around it. And we were actually really pleased with the first few months, which we reflect, of course, in the annual report about how the framework was going. So we do feel that when we get back to graded full inspections, then the EIF is the right vehicle for that. But of course, we will, as I said, we will look at that from a COVID perspective as well, and ensure that if there are any slight modifications that are needed, we'll make those, but also ensure that we can operate safely, we can collect the evidence that we need to make secure judgments.
Thank you, Chris. Amanda, is there anything you wanted to add to that before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, just to say that the framework has real power. This focus on the substance of education, I think, sets up the right conversation about how schools have had to adapt and flex. It's very much moved away from something that's sort of more tightly linked to published results, which of course is important. There aren't published results this year. So I think it's really going to help us concentrate on the things that matter most to schools in this very tough time, schools and all providers in these very tough times.
And I think actually, sorry, Chris, I mean, just to add there as well, I think what we'll be able to do too is through that to actually really look at remote learning within context about how schools, as all schools are, how they're using remote learning, but in the context of the curriculum, and how well it links to the curriculum and how well it's used to deliver the curriculum as part of that wider picture.
Thanks, Chris. And as always, as soon as I start to talk about wrapping up, other questions come in. So we have got a couple more questions, which is great. Yvette, I'll come back to you. Harvey Gallagher from the Nationwide Association of Fostering Providers says independent fostering agencies have had very few assurance visits so far, but local and national restrictions guidance and regulations have changed a number of times. Will Ofsted consider the time and context in which IFA decisions were made this year?
Absolutely. So Harvey is right. We've prioritised in our regulatory work the places where children live and the places where we're concerned about. So our visit profile won't be evenly across all of our sub-remits. And when we come back and visit, we're looking at good decision making for children, absolutely aware of the context in which you're operating.
Thank you, Yvette. Karen, I'm going to come to you. Another question from David Hatchett from AET. As many inspectors these days are practitioners, does Ofsted have sufficient workforce to carry out a full programme of inspections when these restart, given many practitioners will need to remain in their settings for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, thanks for the question, David. Clearly, we do have a challenge with nearly 70% of our Ofsted inspectors being serving practitioners, as you've recognised, but we are working very closely and keeping in touch with all of those Ofsted inspectors. And we already know that a number of them, despite the challenges in their settings, are interested in getting back to doing some inspection for us. That, along with 30% of non-serving practitioners in that workforce and our own employed workforce, means that we are confident that we will have the capacity to do our inspections next year.
Thank you, Karen. A question for Chris. Return to inspections from Elaine Segar from the Sunflower Group. Return to inspections, non-graded inspections. Does this include early years? We're looking at our inspection work really across the remit areas, including early years. And obviously, once we get back to graded inspections, then early years would be part of that, as it's within the education inspection framework. But Yvette might want to add something to that.
Just to say, as I'm sure early years practitioners out there will realise, that the regulated settings are still getting monitoring visits. We're still following up on actions that were at previous inspections. And so, you know, as I think Amanda alluded in her introduction, our remits are different because of the risk to children will be different, and in some places with a regulator and inspector. But absolutely, we're keen to get back to EIF to have that broader view of our early years settings as well. Thank you, Yvette. Chris, another one for you from Billy Camden from FE Week. Is Ofsted worried about the growth of new apprenticeship providers and soon to be new traineeship providers?
I think it's not for us to be worried so much about growth, really. What we would worry about is the quality, and as we say in the report, we have some concerns over the quality in some cases, and of our new provider monitoring visits over the year, in a quarter we've found progress to be insufficient, and that does give us a worry. So, you know, we will continue to look very closely within those visits and within the follow-ups at what the quality is, and whether, because quite often we're finding that the leadership isn't sharp enough, that the curriculum isn't well thought out enough, and that when we return, actually we're sometimes finding that the actions that we've pointed out that are needed haven't been taken quickly enough. So, you know, we point out that this is a weaker area, apprenticeships, and that we'll be focusing sharply therefore on that as we do our work over the coming months.
Thank you, Chris. Yvette, I'll come back to you. Laura Bundock from Sky News. What more needs to happen to identify vulnerable children, especially children who have disappeared from school since the pandemic?
Well, as HMCI set out in her speech, referrals from schools have gone down to social care, and indeed from health at key points during the pandemic. But they are on the rise. I think the key thing is that everybody works together to make sure they all play their part, making referrals for those children that they're really most concerned about. I think there is a piece of work between schools and local authorities for those children who have gone off role, where they need to follow up to make sure that they've landed somewhere, that if their parents have chosen to home education, that due process is followed for that. There will be, sadly, some children that disappear from one school role, and it needs some really careful work between that school, the local authority, to make sure that we all know where they are now. That's something that I know that local partnerships, local safeguarding partnerships have got their eyes on at the minute, but it does need some really careful work, making sure that every single child lands somewhere and that we know they're safe and well.
Thanks, Yvette. Amanda, I'll come back to you for this one. It's Chris McDonald from Just Go. How will inspections take account of the challenge schools face in encouraging children to engage with remote learning?
Well, it's very important that we recognise the difficulties here. I've talked to quite a few schools and colleges about this. We really do, and our interim visits also have helped us here. We really do understand that there are in nearly every school there are proportions of children who haven't engaged or who've engaged very patchily. This is part of the value of the work we're doing through the autumn, both through the survey that we're doing and through these sort of in-depth discussions with a number of schools about their remote learning models, to help us get underneath sort of what good participation looks like, what's the right level at which to pitch expectations that is high enough, but not beyond anything that anybody has been able to achieve. It's a balance that it's really important that we strike well.
Thank you, Amanda. That brings us to the end of today's event. As Amanda says, you can also watch videos on our YouTube channel specific to the different remits that we inspect and regulate. And of course, you can keep on tweeting about the report or anything you've heard today using the hashtag OfstedAR20. Just remains to be said thank you to everyone who's attended. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we see you again next year.